Lights back on. Thank you. So it really gives me great honor. I'm really thrilled to be sitting right next to someone who really is an icon. Well, you're an icon. Your daddy was an icon, and I didn't know him. Civil rights leader extraordinaire James Forman and his son James Forman Jr., who is right here today. You know, I knew James when he was with the Public Defender Service. You didn't know I knew you, but I knew you because I kind of been following you. I knew when you started, helped to start the Maya Angelou Public Charter School, and you know, just all the great and fabulous things. So when I found out that you were doing a book and doing a book about what was going on in my hometown, because I'm a D.C. girl, a native Washingtonian, I was very interested and I was very excited. And when you first started talking, I must admit, I'm being very honest, I was a little bit concerned. It was like, how is he going to address this? And, you know, I'm not quite sure, you know, about the premise and all like that. But I'm telling you, when the book came out and I read it, Locking Up Our Own Crime and Punishment in Black America by James Forman Jr., it was a book that I could not put down. It was very, very relevant. It was excellently written. We're talking about a book that was on the Washington Post bestseller and the New York Times best choice, seller's choice, editor's, editor's choice. I just want to share something that Van Jones wrote on the back of the book. James Forman masterfully explores why so many African Americans supported tough criminal laws over the past 50 years and why more recently their attitudes began to shift, combining dramatic stories from his work as a public defender with original historical research. Foreman uncovers mass incarceration's hidden history while documenting its human costs. Beautifully written, powerfully argued, and most of all, deeply empathetic. Okay? Locking Up Our Own should be read by everyone who cares about race and justice in America, Van Jones. And Brian Stevenson says, Locking Up Our Own is an engaging, insightful, and provocative re examination of over incarceration in the black community. James Forman Jr. carefully exposes the complexities of crime, criminal justice, and race, and what he illuminates should not be ignored. That's from Brian Stevenson. So, James is a professor of law at Yale Law School and former clerk for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. James, we love you. Let's go on in. Talk to us, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Yes.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that introduction. Nikichi says that she's been following me, but really I think the truth is I'm the one that's been following her, and I have proof, because in this book, on page 205, Nikichi Taifa is cited and quoted, and I want you to understand not just that she's cited, but I want you to hear what she said and when she said it. I'm talking now here about the Sentencing Project. Shout out to the Sentencing Project. I'm talking about their report in the 90s, the first report documenting the 1 in 4 young black men under criminal justice supervision, their first report. And then I say, the report was widely disseminated and discussed, especially by black commentators, with the ACLU's Nikichi Taifa, for example, comparing the double standard in American criminal justice to slavery and Jim Crow. 1994. So she's been on it. She's been on it. I want to also thank the Open Society Foundations. A grant supported the writing of this book, and a group of people came together in this office a couple of years ago, which Nikichi hosted, to give me feedback on an early draft of some chapters. And this room is full of people who are my heroes, the people whose work is cited throughout this book. But I just have to give a particular shout out to PDS, the Public Defender Service representatives here, because that is my heart. It's where I started. I'm going to tell a story about my work at PDS. And in a lot of ways, this book, I was on a panel about this book in Baltimore the day before it was released, and Judge Andre Davis, retired judge on the Fourth Circuit, said that one of the things he liked about this book, he said, was that he felt like I was fair to everybody, but I was also critical of everybody. And when he made that comment, I realized that as much as I embraced it, any author wants compliments, that he was wrong in one way, which is there's one group of people that is not criticized in this book, and that is public defenders. This is a love letter. This is a love letter to public defenders. And I didn't even mean it that way, but it's just my bias because that's the role that I'm playing in the story, right? So what I want to do is I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about why I decided to write the book, a few minutes on the main kind of arguments of the book, and then just wrap up with what I see as some of the implications. I'll be shorter on the implications part with this group than I normally would be because the policy expertise in the room is greater than mine, and so I feel a little like ridiculous, trying to tell y'all what we should be doing when it's you who know the best. But I'll just spend a couple minutes on that. So I really had two motivations for writing the book. One of them had nothing to do with the criminal justice system. Oh, and I should just say by way, one more introductory thought, which is that I have just a few copies of the book. This space was so full and so crowded that we didn't even have room to bring a bookseller today. But at the end of the session, I will be out there in the alcove. I have about 6 or 7 copies, and cash and credit card are accepted. So if anybody wants to buy and get a copy signed, or if anybody has one and you want it signed, I'll be out there for that. But I should say that my motivations, one of them had nothing to do with the criminal justice system. And I don't know if anybody else in the room is like this, but I'm the kind of person who, if I go to a film and there's no black characters in the film, when it's over and somebody says, well, how did you feel about the movie? My first reaction is always, where were the black characters? And I feel that way not just about film, I feel that way about literature, I feel that way about art, I feel that way about history, I feel that way about law. So I knew that when I wrote my first book, I wanted to write a book that had African American characters front and central in the narrative. Now, the other reason was very much related to the criminal justice system. So there's as Van said in his nice endorsement, there are a lot of stories in this book. And one of the stories that I tell from Superior Court is of a client of mine named Brandon. Brandon was a teenager charged with possession of a gun. He had pled guilty, possession of a gun and possession of a small amount of marijuana, about $15, $20 worth. And I was his lawyer representing him. And I had taken the job because I viewed this as the civil rights work of my generation. We didn't have the term mass incarceration yet. This is the mid-1990s. But we did know from the Sentencing Project that 1 in 4, and then they came out 1 in 3, young African-American men under criminal justice supervision. We did have commentators like Nikichi pointing out the double standards and hearkening back to earlier historical eras. My parents met in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. My dad's African-American, my mom is white, my dad was the executive secretary. They came together in a union at a time when, and I have to honor Loving versus Virginia here, they came together when interracial marriages were illegal in many states, and the anniversary of Loving was yesterday. So I come out of that tradition, and I also come having benefited from their work. There I am, clerking on the Supreme Court, getting to be a lawyer at the Public Defender Service, things that were not imaginable to somebody of my father's generation, a black man growing up in Jim Crow in Mississippi and in Chicago as he did. And at the same time, those numbers that we all know are starting to be reported. And I knew it from my own growing up in Atlanta, that a lot of kids that I went to high school with were not making it, and for too many of them, the reason was getting caught up in the criminal justice system. So the charge to me seemed obvious. So I'm representing Brandon, and I'm asking for him to be released. His mom and grandmother are there in court. They've been in court every single court hearing, standing up for him. I have a letter from a teacher, and I have a letter from a counselor at school testifying to his good character is his first arrest. Brandon, like almost all my clients in D.C. and Superior Court, is African American. The prosecutor asking for him to go to Oak Hill and just pause. There's a lot of young faces in this crowd, but there's also people that have been around DC and know Oak Hill. Oak Hill was DC's juvenile facility, and it was really a dungeon. No functioning school, no programs worth their name, and some of the people around this table are responsible for getting it closed. And congratulations to that effort. But it's still open when I'm in court with Brandon, and the prosecutor's asking him to go there. The prosecutor's also African American. The judge that has to make the decision in the case, Judge Curtis Walker, and I should say, I changed the names of the clients, lawyers, and judges in all of these stories to protect their confidentiality. Judge Curtis Walker is looking out of the courtroom. He's got a young black man on trial who pled guilty facing sentencing, 2 African-American lawyers arguing different sides of the case. He, the judge, is himself African-American. And he looks into Brandon and he says, son, Mr. Forman has been telling me that you've had a difficult life and you deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about Jim Crow. Son, people fought, marched, and died for you to be free. Dr. King died for your freedom. And I tell you this, he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your family and embarrassing your community. No, that was not his dream at all. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope you turn it around. But right now, son, actions have consequences. And your consequence is Oak Hill. He locked him up. And that wasn't the only time in DC as a public defender that I had been in a courtroom where many of us were African Americans. But there was something about that case in particular and his invocation of Dr. King. See, the same person that I was drawing inspiration, I thought I was the King figure in the story, right? I'm the one that's fighting the civil rights issue of my generation. And he's using the same history to reach an opposite conclusion. And so it seems to me at that moment that there's a story that needs to be told. Somebody needs to write a story to tell the history with empathy, with compassion, with humanity, but also where appropriate with criticism of how it is that many of us in our community came to endorse some of the same tactics that the nation was pursuing in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And that was the book that I wanted to write. So, having asked the question, why, right? Why did this community come to lock up so many of its own? Because at the time, the incarceration rate in DC, Eric helped to write a report showing that picking up on what the Sentencing Project had found and showing that in DC, the 1 in 3 number was 1 in 2. And this is with the city council now, because this judge is not alone. The city council that passed the laws that Brandon was sentenced under, the gun and the drug laws, majority African-American city council. Police force, mostly black. Police chief then, African-American, and had been since Bertel Jefferson, 1979. So, how? How did this happen? There's 3 kind of, a lot of arguments in the book, but we've only got so much time. I'm going to focus on 3. The first thing that we really have to grapple with is crime, violence, addiction, the toll that they took on black communities. In my opinion, too many of us who are critical of mass incarceration and over-punishment and over-punitiveness, we pass over. We might mention, there's a sentence or 2 about crime, and then we move on. But this book dwells on it because I think that the community was consumed by it. That's what my research shows. So homicide, remember now, my book picks up really in the mid-70s. This first generation of African-American officials in DC, the first home rule city council was elected in 1975. Nationwide, there's an 800% increase in African-American elected officials in the 1970s, I'm sorry. But what's right before they come in is the 1960s, and the largest decades-long crime rise in American history. The homicide rate increases 300% in DC in the 1960s. It doubles nationally. Heroin addiction. When I talk to my students today about the war on drugs, some of them will remember crack. I think that commercial came out during the crack years, the war on, this is your brain on drugs, I'm not sure. But what not a lot of people remember, at least the younger people, is that heroin was the crack before crack. Devastated black communities. In DC in 1963, they tested everybody entering the DC jail for heroin. 3% of the people were heroin addicts. By 1969, that 3% had become 45%. That's an epidemic. And it's not just, right, the numbers. We see that then happen again in the crack years. It's also the pain and the anguish and the fear that those numbers generate in a community. One of the things that I did is a lot of the DC Council members have turned their papers over to libraries around DC, GW, Howard, Martin Luther King branch of the DC Public Library. And when you look through those papers, which are not easily organized for a researcher because they're not organized by subject matter, they're organized by address. So you have to look at every address that anybody ever wrote a letter from to find, and when you pull out those letters though, you find a lot of letters about drugs and violence. People saying, I feel like a prisoner in my, these are 1970s, black citizens writing to their newly elected black representatives, saying, I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I feel like a stranger on my streets. I can't go outside and take my kids to school because of the drug dealers on the corner. They're shooting in the park. I don't even want to leave my kid in the park. And there's dirty syringes there. And then over and over again, do something. Do something. You have to do something about this. Now, who's receiving these letters? This is the second big argument in the book. The folks that are receiving these letters are this first generation of African-American elected officials. Many of them from the South, some of them from the civil rights movement. All of them remember the deep history, profound and long history of under-enforcement of law and under-protection in African-American communities. They remember the history that led to 911 is a joke. They remember that you didn't call the police in black communities in the 1940s, 1950s. They weren't going to come, and if they did, they were just going to make matters worse. They remember Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan said, that's not murder, that's just another dead black person. And they did not use the words black person. So now, here they are in office. They are bound and determined to respond to those letter writers, to give that community that is begging for protection the answer that they never got under Jim Crow. And this is just a pause here. One thing that I think my book does, if it does nothing else, it is to absolutely demolish the lie that you hear that the black community only cares about violence and crime when it's police officers. You know, you hear that from the right. How come they never complain about crime in their own communities, right? How come they only complain when well, those letters that I just mentioned and the response from those representatives, there's 240 pages of proof in this book that is a lie. That we have always cared about crime and violence in our communities, regardless of who's doing the crime. Okay, so they care, right? They care and they want to respond, and many of this first generation of elected officials, prosecutors, police chiefs, judges, they're like the judge that I said in the opening story, Judge Walker. They see the protection of the community as a civil rights issue. Okay, fine. But why with police? Why with prosecutors, right? So I get you, right? You want to protect the community, and crime and violence are real. But why was that the go-to answer, right? And that gets to the third big argument in the book. This is a book. I said up front I wanted to write a book with African-American characters front and central. But in America, with its history of racism and white supremacy, and with us as 12% of the population, any book that's about African-American characters is also going to be about the constraints and the limitations that they were under. right? The people that I'm writing about didn't have all the power that they wanted or needed to solve this problem. So let's talk about what some of those constraints are. The first constraint that this group of African American officials is under is historical, right? The history of racism that includes redlining and Jim Crow and deindustrialization and the vacuuming out of wealth of black communities that Ta-Nehisi Coates has written about so eloquently, to the point where the neighborhoods that this group of elected officials is responsible for protecting don't have enough resources to protect themselves, right? So that's the first constraint. In a lot of ways, you could think of this book as, Jelani Cobb, we did a panel, the writer for The New Yorker, we did a panel in New York, and he asked me a question, which I've since turned into kind of a statement. He said, so is it fair to say that the people that you're writing about had the power to respond to crime, but they lacked the power to respond to the underlying conditions that generate crime? And my answer was yes, and it's a great question, and it's an important point. Okay, the second constraint. This is a political one, and it will be well understood to everybody in this room, a lot of y'all who work on both local, state, and national issues. The people that I'm writing about, overwhelmingly, their power was local. These are local elected officials. And although one of my big arguments is that when we think about criminal justice reform, we need to focus on the local, it's also true that there are limitations, of course, to what cities can do. So you see this over and over again. Black community representatives, activists, elected officials that I'm writing about, they'll say, we want an all-of-the-above strategy to fighting crime. Yes, we want more police and we want more prosecutors, and sometimes even people will say we want longer sentences and more prisons. But we also want to fight racism, we want better schools, we want an investment in housing, we want drug treatment, we want mental health programs, we want after-school programs. They have an all-of-the-above strategy, but for so many of those things, they need support from Congress. They say, when they passed the local gun control law in DC, they said, we also want national gun control. Needed Congress to do that. That doesn't happen. Because at the national level, there isn't that same care and concern for those letter writers that I described. Those don't register in the same way at the congressional level. People over and over again say, we want a Marshall Plan for urban America. I hear that for 50 years. It's throughout the record. We want America to invest in its black communities the same way America invested in Europe after World War II. Doesn't happen. So they wanted all of the above, and they got one of the above, which was law enforcement. And the last constraint that I want to identify is constraint of imagination. So one of my main arguments in this book is that some of how mass incarceration developed, we can look to villains, right? There are villains in the story. There are people who actively wanted to suppress and oppress African Americans. But there's also a story about people who aren't villainous, but are still constrained in all kinds of ways, including constrained by imagination. So one of the examples that I use in the book for this is Dave Clark. For folks that have been around this city for a while, the name Dave Clark will mean something. He was, when DC Council first got home rule in 1975, there were 13 members on the council, 11 African American, 2 white. Dave Clark was one of the 2 white members. Graduate of Howard Law School, worked with Martin Luther King, lawyer for poor people, gets on the city council. Dave Clark's first thing in office is to fight for marijuana decriminalization. For those of y'all that are interested in drug policy, chapter 1 of the book is about an attempt in 1975 to decriminalize marijuana, led by Dave Clark. It almost passes. Why it doesn't, I think, is a fascinating story, but that one I'm going to have to save for the book. But now, a few years later, early 1980s, Dave Clark's chair of the city council. He's getting bombarded with letters from citizens. The heroin crisis has returned in the late 70s, early 80s. People are saying, there's addicts in front of my house, and I don't want to leave my house because they're hanging out. There's addicts in front of my business, and they're keeping customers away. Do something. So Dave Clark does what we would all want our elected representative to do. He forwards that letter to the head of the relevant government agency to deal with the problem. He then gets a response back from the head saying, I'm on it. And he then forwards that response back to the citizen. So imagine as a citizen, that's good, right? You're like, I wrote my representative, they took action, now I'm reading about what they're going to do. Who did he send it to? Did he send it to the head of the Department of Mental Health? Department of Addiction Services? No, he sent the complaint about addicts on the corner. Of course, this being America and us being constrained by our imaginations, he sent it to the police chief. Because in this country, we think of those problems. Even those of us like Clark who are not drug warriors, we have come to, we have been acculturated to, we have been conditioned to, taught to think about that issue as a public safety issue that requires law enforcement, not as a public health issue that requires community services. So that's how we got here, I argue. How much time do we have left?
15 minutes.
We need to
Some
go.
Q&A.
I'm going to stop here. What I am not going to talk about, because we're out of time, but would love to continue this conversation, and there's some of this in the book, is responding to that, right? What are the implications of this history for how we respond now, right? How we resist, dismantle over punitive criminal justice system and mass incarceration and replace it with something that is healing, that is meaningful, that gives people safety and gives people justice without producing the incredible, devastating community costs that mass incarceration has brought to America. Thank you.
Let's give it up. Thank you. Now, if that didn't inspire you to go on and get the book, I don't know what will. We were going to do Q&A like this. I need you to go to where Jasmine Mickens, the Senior Policy Associate there. Raise your hand high. Jasmine, we're going to line up there so we can get a feel for how many. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So